Hello, everybody. Welcome to Keynes IV. We're going to break this section up into two smaller parts to be covered in 1 week, I believe. The first part is going to be about building your aggregate demand curve, and the second part will be talking about long-run aggregate supply. Later on, we'll start putting these things together in a model of some economic crises such as the Great Depression. What are we going to be doing here? We'll be constructing the aggregate demand curve from the ISLM model. We'll understand the connection between the behaviors of ISLM that we've already studied and gotten very intimately familiar with, and the subsequent reactions of the aggregate demand curve. Essentially, that aggregate demand curve is a summary of everything you learned in the product market, the circular flow, the money market, the ISLM. We're going to look at policy effectiveness and make sure that we understand the differing opinions about policy effectiveness coming from different schools of thought, primarily the classicals and the Keynesian schools of thought. And then we're going to build our long-run aggregate supply curve and our short-run aggregate supply curve, put them all together and have a pretty solid model, very nuanced model of the macroeconomy. From ISLM to aggregate demand. Up until now, we've been building a detailed model of the equilibrium. Output is equal to expenditure. You've seen a lot of different equilibrium statements about this. One of them was Y is equal to E. The other one is Y is equal to C plus I plus G. The other one was, of course, leakages equal to injections. And at every stage of this development, we derived models for the variables that were endogenous. So we derived an equation to understand the behavior of consumption. We looked at the investment variable, and we determined the interest rate in the money market. All of this allowed us to solve for Y, which was an equilibrium between the IS and LM, the product market, and the money market. At every stage, we analyzed the model in the context of fiscal and monetary policy, as well as in the absence of fiscal and monetary policy, just dealing with shocks like trade shocks or investment expectation shocks or the like. But up to this point, we've left one key variable out. We haven't really explained it. We haven't talked about what determines it. And that key variable that we're talking about now is, of course, the aggregate price level, which is, in this model, the price level for Y, output, which is given to us by the GDP deflator. In fact, up until this point, we've been operating underneath the assumption that prices were just assumed to be fixed, and we would solve every other variable with prices being fixed. Now we're going to analyze the model with the inclusion of prices being variable, and we'll see how it affects our model. We'll be able to, in the end analysis, form a model of one of our key important macroeconomic variables, which is the aggregate price level, and so we'll be able to construct a model for price determination. As we're going through this, just keep in mind the way we're kind of organizing the assumptions, the theoretical assumptions that go into building the different schools of thought and different behavior of models for the macroeconomy. In the extreme short run, we are going to be assuming that prices are completely fixed, and this is a Keynesian kind of thing. In the short run, prices are going to be considered to be flexible but rigid or sticky, and we'll show you the importance of that. This is also from the Keynesian perspective. And then, of course, in the long run, everything is perfect, and this is a classical model, and so prices are perfectly flexible. Well, now we're dealing with variable prices. What does that imply for our model? With prices being fixed, there was no distinction between real and nominal variables. Any movement in the nominal money supply was also a movement in the real money supply. Any movement in the nominal wage was also an increase in the real wage. And any movement in the nominal interest rate was also a movement in the real interest rate. They were just simultaneously determined because prices were fixed, so there was no difference between the two. With prices being variable, we now have to make sure that we're distinguishing between nominal variables and real variables. And if you'll remember, there's always that handy rule of thumb that it takes two nominal variables to make a real variable. So when we're dealing with real variables, there are two reasons why that real variable might change. One of the reasons might be a movement in the nominal variable, and the other one might be a movement in the price variable. So here we have a couple real variables. You can see that rule of thumb playing out. The real wage is constructed of two nominal variables. In the numerator, we have the nominal wage, the money wage, and then, of course, we have the money wage divided by the price level, which tells us how many real goods and services a given amount of money will buy. This is the real wage, and it tells us what work is worth in terms of real goods and services that can be purchased. Two reasons the real wage might increase: one, if the nominal wage W rose, and two, if the aggregate price level P declined. Our second real variable, this is all review for you, I know, is the real interest rate. And according to the Fisher equation, we have the real interest rate is equal to, again, two nominal variables, the nominal interest rate I and inflation. Reasons why the real interest rate might rise. Again, there's two. One of them could be that the nominal interest rate I increased, and the other could be deflation. We also have real money balances, which is a variable that we haven't looked at before. Before, we simply looked at the nominal money supply, which was M. But here, we're going to be dividing the money supply by P, sort of like our real wage. And this tells us the purchasing power of money in terms of real goods and services. Now, previously, we were looking at shifts in the LM curve because of changes in M, which would have been initiated by the Federal Reserve or the central bank in some other cases, right? Now we can look at changes in the money supply and subsequent shifts in the LM curve being motivated not by movements in M and not by actions of the central bank, but instead as consequences of movements in the aggregate price level, P. Now, it is, in fact, this connection that will allow us to derive the aggregate demand curve from the ISLM model. Let's go ahead and take a look at this. The aggregate demand curve is given to you in the right panel, and our typical ISLM model with the inclusion of real money balances is in the left panel. You've had a Macroeconomics 101 class, and so you've seen aggregate demand curves before. Now you're seeing the way that we build them, the deep, sort of intimate, nuanced, and calibrated way that we can build them. The aggregate demand curve, as you know, is downward sloping. And so as the aggregate price level changes, it causes increases and decreases in aggregate demand. Particularly as the price level increases, there is a reduction in aggregate demand. And as the price level falls, there's an increase in aggregate demand. So we want to explain how do we derive this downward sloping aggregate demand curve from our ISLM model. Well, let's take a look at starting at point C here at a price level of P naught and a level of output Y naught, and those are points referenced on your aggregate demand curve. So P naught and Y naught providing us a point on the aggregate demand curve of C. Now do note that that aggregate demand curve has been drawn, and it's been indicated that there is a particular quantity of money, nominal money in the economy, and that quantity of money is M naught. Well, let's go ahead and assume that the price level were to rise from P naught to P1. What would happen? Looking at our ISLM model, this would be factored in as a change in the money supply. Particularly, it would be factored in as a reduction in real money balances. So our initial equilibrium corresponding to point C on the aggregate demand curve is also point C in the ISLM model. Point C occurs at a level of income Y naught, consistent with our aggregate demand curve. The LM curve is consistent with money of M naught and a price level P naught, consistent with point C in the aggregate demand curve. And in the ISLM model, all of these variables are being connected to an interest rate of R naught, again at point C. As the price level increases from P naught to P1, real money balances fall. And this becomes a reduction in the money supply. There is now excess money demand in the money market, and the interest rate must rise to get rid of that extra money demand. As the interest rate rises, of course, investment falls, and this causes a negative multiplier, causing consumption and also the level of income to fall. Falling level of income, together with rising interest rates, lowers excess money demand. And we see the LM curve shift from LM, characterized by M naught P naught, to LM, characterized by M naught P1. It's a leftward shift of the LM curve, the same as you would model for a reduction of the money supply. However, this shift is a reduction in real money balances rather than the money supply itself. It's motivated by an increase in prices. So we move from point C to point B, and as we're moving from point C to point B, investment is falling, consumption is falling, and income is falling, and that's the connection there. So corresponding to our aggregate demand curve, we see the movement from C to B. Again, we're riding along the aggregate demand curve. So something is determining the slope of this thing, and what it is rising interest rates causing falling consumption and falling investment, leading to a reduction in aggregate demand. We can continue this exact same explanation moving from point B to point A. Again, the idea is as the price level increases, real money balances fall, interest rates rise, consumption and investment declines, and we see a lower level of income. Now, keep in mind that we've been running this model as if it were a closed economy, and so we've been excluding a lot of talk about the external sector or the open economy, which would entail dealing with exchange rates and exports and imports. Do note that if we open up a discussion about the role of net exports in aggregate demand, as the domestic price level rises, foreigners would buy fewer American exports, and imports would look more attractive to domestic consumers. Consequently, the country's net export position would deteriorate, and this would also reduce aggregate demand. We've just shown you how to construct the downward slope of aggregate demand, and I want you all to be very familiar with the key reasons that are motivating that explanation. So as the price level changes, it triggers three primary effects. The first one is called the wealth effect, and this is when consumers' real wealth declines as the price level increases, and this causes consumption to fall. The second, more obvious one from our previous exposition is called the interest rate effect. Interest rates rise as the price level increases, causing investment to decline. And three, the exchange rate effect. Rising prices will cause a real exchange rate appreciation, reducing the trade balance. The idea here again, right, we've got an equation there. That equation is the real exchange rate, and the explanation is the same as our note on the previous page. This real exchange rate talks about the real cost of buying goods domestically and in a foreign context. This real exchange rate is effectively the relative price of foreign goods to domestic goods evaluated in domestic currency. In the numerator, we have PF, which would be the price of foreign goods, and that would be denominated in euro or yen or yuan renminbi, but we've multiplied it by the exchange rate in order to convert it into dollar terms. So up there we have the dollar price of buying foreign goods, and then in the denominator we of course have P, which is the domestic price level. If the domestic price level is increasing, that real exchange rate dips below 1, which means that the numerator is less than the denominator. If you're shopping, you want to buy where things are cheaper, and so you're going to buy from the numerator rather than from the denominator. What you're going to do is import goods. From the perspective of foreigners, they'll be avoiding your exports because it's cheaper for them to buy the goods at home. Again, we have the deterioration of net exports. Now, I won't be testing you on the real exchange rate because this is not an international econ class, but I would be remiss if I didn't bring it up and also give it some form of technical explanation so that you can entrench it in your mind somewhere. I will, however, want you to know what, in general, the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the exchange rate effect are. And I would also like you to know that they are the rationales for which we explain the downward slope in our aggregate demand curve. So we've got an aggregate demand curve. It's downward sloping in the GDP deflator. Hopefully we're going to be able to continue to see how movement in the ISLM model is connected to aggregate demand and how movement in the ISLM model is connected to movements in aggregate demand, meaning that if we understand the way shocks impact ISLM and the magnitude at which those shocks impact ISLM, we'll also be able to read those explanations in the aggregate demand curve. So I think it's interesting because you guys start with aggregate demand and aggregate supply in a 101 class, but they don't really explain to you where it all comes from. In intermediate macro, we give you a much deeper view and a more thorough analysis, which of course can be calibrated numerically to form particularized models of particular economies. Let's now turn to the shifts in the aggregate demand curve. We've looked at the slope of the aggregate demand curve. Let's determine what moves it around. Shifts in the aggregate demand curve. Well, obviously, they're going to come from shocks in the ISLM model, and one of the reasons you can get a shift in the aggregate demand curve is because of shifts in the LM curve. Now, we looked at movement in the LM curve, and if it's motivated by price changes, then it is modeled as a movement along the aggregate demand curve. But if it's motivated by something other than price changes, then it's going to be thought of as a shift in aggregate demand. So let's take a look at this connection between movement in LM and movement in AD. Let's start in the right panel. We've got aggregate demand curve, and we've got an initial equilibrium at point A. At point A, we are having this point characterized by P naught and Y naught. Let's find the corresponding point in our model on panel left, which is the ISLM schedules. Point A, again, it's an equilibrium. It's an intersection between LM and IS, and it's also a point on the aggregate demand curve. It occurs at an income level Y naught and at a interest rate R naught. The money supply is M naught, and the price level, again, is P naught. So all of our variables sync up there. We're operating at point A. Now we have a shift in the LM curve, and this moves us from LM characterized by M naught P naught to LM characterized by M1 P naught. This is an increase in the money supply. And as we know, an increase in the money supply shifts the LM curve to the right. For a given price level, an increase in the money supply will lower interest rates and stimulate business investment. If you'll remember your money market, what's happening here is at point A, you had an equilibrium between money supply and money demand. Money supply increased, which gives us excess money supply. We've got to bring money demand up to the new higher money supply, and we achieve that through falling interest rates and rising income. As the interest rate declines, we start seeing an increase in investment and then multiplier effects on consumption, moving towards point B at interest rate R1 and Y1. So we've got a new higher level of aggregate demand, but we're operating at the same price level. P naught hasn't changed at all. So we're still at P naught, but we've got a higher equilibrium level of income from the ISLM model. If we're looking at our aggregate demand curve, the best way to model this is to keep P naught and simply shift aggregate demand from point A to point B, reflecting an increase in the money supply. You'll note that that aggregate demand curve indicates that the shift was motivated by an increase in money supply. Our initial aggregate demand curve, YD naught at M naught, now becomes YD1 at M1. So the magnitude of this shift depends upon the effectiveness of monetary policy. And if you'll remember from past lectures, the effectiveness of monetary policy depends upon elasticities of money demand and elasticities of investment. And money as a policy variable has a larger impact when there is a flat IS curve and a relatively steep LM curve. So the question as to would monetary policy be highly effective at influencing aggregate demand, the answer is yes if the IS curve is relatively flat and the LM curve is relatively steep. And this is, of course, the way that classicals view the ISLM and also the way that the monetarist school views ISLM. Both of them take it that money is highly effective at managing or influencing aggregate demand. Now, you can imagine, obviously, I think it's obvious to you, what direction would the aggregate demand curve shift if the money supply was reduced? And if your answer is to the left, you would be right. But these are the underlying mechanics of what's happening there. So here we have shifts in the aggregate demand curve from movement in LM, which embodies our monetary policy. Let's move on to look at movement in the IS curve. IS factors that shift the aggregate demand curve, well, it'll be anything that shifts the IS curve. And our equation for equilibrium there, again, was, delta Y is equal to the multiplier multiplied by changes in any of our 4 autonomous variables. Our 4 autonomous variables included investment, wealth effects, and also fiscal policy. So the IS factors that will shift the LM curve, anything that shifts the IS curve, these could be taxes, could be government purchases, could be investor expectations, or it could be a wealth effect. Now, I've also included 5 there, which is trade shocks. We don't have trade shocks in the equation because we closed the economy. But for those of you interested in moving into international econ, you can probably start thinking about the way movement in net exports would shift IS and LM. So we have a generalized kind of model drawn for you here. It can really account for just about anything that would motivate the IS curve to shift. And let's take a look at it. So we start off with a aggregate demand curve YD and point A occurring at P naught. And that corresponds to point A in the ISLM model occurring in an interest rate R naught. First thing that happens is we get a rightward shift in IS from IS to IS prime. Let's talk about how that could happen. It could happen if taxes were reduced, in which case the magnitude of that shift would be delta Y equals 1 over 1 minus B multiplied by whichever autonomous shift was taking place, in this case taxes, so it'd be multiplied by delta negative BT. It could have been motivated by an increase in government purchases, in which case the magnitude of the shift from A to B, that size delta Y, would be 1 over 1 minus B multiplied by delta G. It could have been motivated by investor expectations. What kind of investment expectations? Well, probably some form of optimism or bullishness, in which case the magnitude of the shift from A to B would be delta Y is equal to the multiplier multiplied by delta I, and so on, with the wealth effect being motivated by changes in autonomous consumption, delta A. So we see this shift outward in IS generating a higher level of income, and we all know that that puts pressure on the money market, particularly with excess money demand. That excess money demand causes interest rates to rise. As interest rates rise, investment falls and income falls with it, together with a negative multiplier effect with consumption. So our initial shock moves the economy from A to B, and then the slopes of the ISLM determine how much interest rates will rise and income will fall. This movement from B to C is crowding out. It's the way that the interest rate dampens these shocks. And so the shift overall at the end story of aggregate demand will depend upon how much crowding out takes place. Is there a lot of falling income from B to C, or is there very little falling income from B to C? That will determine effectively how large the net shift is on aggregate demand. In aggregate demand, we shift from point A to point B, and then after crowding out to point C. Now, hopefully, if you're looking at that top graph and you've been paying a lot of attention in the previous classes, you're going to see the largest shift to aggregate demand when you see a very, very flat LM curve and a very, very steep IS curve. So when you're looking for effectiveness of fiscal policy or dangerousness from volatility of investor expectations, both of those things, volatility and aggregate demand, are more likely to occur with a flat LM curve and a steep IS curve. These are the conditions for effectiveness of monetary policy, but also conditions for how much volatility in IS will translate into volatility of aggregate demand. Now, visually up there in the top panel, you can just flatten out that LM curve, and then you see that as you flatten out that LM curve, the point C starts falling closer and closer to point B. And this is, of course, the way Keynesians saw the economy. If you're a classical and you're looking at the economy, the LM curve is very, very steep. And so just put a bolt right there through point A and start torquing the LM curve in a counterclockwise direction, making it more and more steep. As you move into the conditions of classical views of the LM curve, you're steepening out that LM curve, and C is moving further and further away from B, and it's going to sit right on the head of A at some point, right? So that's going to completely eliminate volatility from the IS curve in terms of impacting aggregate demand, which is exactly what the classicals thought, right? They thought that only money can influence aggregate demand. Shifts in the IS schedule. Let's look at some special cases, particularly shifts in the IS schedule when the central bank has chosen a policy of fixing the interest rate. When we have a fixed interest rate, the central bank accommodates all movements in money demand with equivalent movements in money supply. Remember, you can fix the interest rate or you can fix the money supply, but you can't fix both. So here the central bank is moving around the money supply to make sure that there's always equilibrium in the money market at R naught. With the interest rate, with the fixed interest rate here, you have the perfect scenario for highly effective shock transmission from IS to AD, because there's no movement in the interest rate, there's no crowding out, and there's nothing to mitigate that volatility. So the IS curve, or any volatility in the IS curve, will impact aggregate demand in an unmitigated fashion. The full size of the shock, the full size of the multiplier will take place without any movement in interest rates. Do note that Keynes believed that the LM curve was relatively flat. Didn't say that it was a fixed interest rate, but he did say it was relatively flat, and that investor expectations were extremely volatile. You'll remember the beauty contest model. He was sort of a behavioral finance guy before the term behavioral finance took place. He thought that irrationality and herding and social swings of psychology could create tremendous volatility in investment, and that could create large economic shocks, such as the Great Financial Crisis, or the Savings and Loan Crisis, or the East Asian Financial Crisis, or the Great Depression. As a consequence, Keynes viewed macroeconomic instability as coming largely from the IS curve. He said, well, if you've got volatility in the economy, it's probably coming from something happening in IS, and it's most likely coming from the investment component of IS. Consequently, he also viewed that fiscal policy would be the more effective way to counter this volatility, because fiscal policy would affect aggregate demand in a more profound way than money would underneath the conditions that he has for slopes of IS and LM. Note here for the classicals, we talked about this just a moment ago, but now we've explicitly shown it to you for the classicals and those individuals who are kind of modern versions of the classicals, the efficient market hypothesis school. These schools of thought believe that investor expectations are stable and that they don't translate to movements in aggregate demand, nor do they translate into movements of IS. They're all dampened out by the interest rate. So with this belief, you have a vertical LM curve and a very, very stable IS curve. But even if you were to have volatility in the IS curve, interest rates would absorb all of that volatility, and output and income would absorb none of it. So for the classicals, shifts in the IS curve, such as an increase in government spending or a reduction in taxes, would be completely crowded out by rising interest rates and would have no impact on the aggregate demand curve. So in a classical world, right, nothing that shifts IS translates into a shifts in aggregate demand. The only thing that translates into aggregate demand moving is money. So again, for classicals, laissez-faire, we have a vertical LM curve. Government is not only ineffective at impacting the economy, they can be considered only to have negative effects. And we'll talk about that in subsequent lectures. This is a good rundown of the translation between ISLM and AD. We've built the curves. We understand the shocks. We understand how aggregate demand will respond to movements in the money supply or monetary policy. We understand how aggregate demand will respond to movements in fiscal policy, and we understand how aggregate demand will respond to volatility of investment expectations. So the next thing that we need to do is build our IS curve, and we'll do this all in the same kind of basic fashion. Build the slope, talk about the shocks, talk about policy, and then in subsequent chapters we'll get into using this IS, LM, and aggregate supply, aggregate demand model to talk about historical shocks that have impacted the economy. So the next thing to do is to crack open Keynes IV Part 2, where we'll be dealing with our aggregate supply curves. Thank you.